First off, I just want to take a moment to give thanks to everyone that's here. Each and every one of us have been involved with this ongoing environmental, economic, and ethical struggle. This year at the conference, there's been several panels addressing the aerial sprays. But just to make it clear, this panel is specifically about a community bill of rights to put an end to aerial sprays. We are a new group that's forming called Freedom from Aerial Herbicide Alliance. And we have our panelists right here, which I'll give a quick introduction. We have Rob Dickinson from Cottage Grove, who is a key organizer of the Freedom from Aerial Herbicide Alliance. And then we have Dowell Orion from Cottage Grove, Alpha Betro, who is the author of The War on Invasives. And we have Eron King from Triangle Lake, who has dealt directly with the assault of aerial sprays. And Roy Keane, who many of us know, who helped initiate in the 1970s the Siskiyou National Forest to put a ban on aerial sprays on federal land. Okay, so we're going to get started right away, and we'll start with Eron.
Oh, I wanted to also mention that I'm going to just put up 1-minute warnings and 2-minute warnings for the speakers.
And also, really quickly, at the end, we'll be circulating petition, and we have pamphlets and et cetera that we'll be handing out.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eron King. I'm here because my entire family was personally affected by aerial herbicide spraying. I'm going to stick to my notes so I get everything in. So I'm here because my story echoes countless of other stories throughout Oregon. It's not a singular incident, and these stories have been told for over 40 years. It also demonstrates the endless cycle that we're forced into, which never actually ends the harm but leads to frustration and, in a lot of cases, defeat. My story also leads us to why we're taking this community rights approach, challenging the current system, and why we're using this charter amendment as our tool. So, as I said, I live in the Triangle Lake area, and I thought I was moving out to the middle of the forest. The Weyerhaeuser let me know I moved into the middle of industrial timberlands. And then the helicopters started coming, and once I realized what was in those helicopters, I remember becoming kind of obsessed with listening for the low thump, 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 thump that would announce the oncoming assault. Then my children became sick. My oldest son started getting bloody noses, sometimes daily, at an alarming rate, kind of scary for a parent. My youngest developed a really deep cough, and that lasted for a better part of a year at one point, and he would cough so hard that it would make him vomit. We took him to doctors, tested him for asthma, allergies. They couldn't figure out what was going on. My partner and I also experienced health effects, not very nice ones, slightly more personal. So I knew I had to do something about it. I couldn't just live there and let that continue. And today, present culture leads us to believe there are only a few avenues that we can go down to address these environmental harms. You can jump into the regulatory system yourself. You can hook up with local environmental groups in the hopes that they can help you navigate your way through the regulatory agency or even through the legislative process. You can also hook up with direct action groups. So at the urging of neighbors, they pointed me to local environmental groups that deal with the issue of pesticides. And at the time, these groups were not touching the issue of timber aerial pesticides, so I kind of had to go into the regulatory system myself and try to deal with the aerial spraying. And so I want to read you some snippets from an article called "Help, I've Been Colonized and I Can't Get Up." This is by Jane Ann Morris, and it really describes, I think, really perfectly what we experience as we go through the regulatory agency system. Our campaigns follow the gambling addiction model. The last bet didn't pay off, but the next one might if we just had a new tripod, had 3 more experts, more labor or church support, 10 more elected officials on our side, 100 more people at that demo, or 1,000 more letters in the mail. Who are we kidding? We're just doing the same old thing over and over again, fooling ourselves that we might actually work next time. We are stuck in a feedback loop where our failures are interpreted as signs that we should repeat our failed tactics but try harder next time. This is what it is to be colonized. The telltale sign is not that we're failing, but that we're fooling ourselves and don't see it as a feedback loop. At regulatory agencies, corporate persons, that is corporations, have constitutional rights to due process and equal protection that human persons, that's us affected as citizens, we do not have. For non-corporate human citizens, there's a democracy theme park where we can pull levers on a voting machine and talk into microphones at hearings. But don't worry, they're not connected to anything and nobody's listening except us. What regulatory law regulates is citizen input, not corporate behavior. So for the next 8 years, I did attend forestry board meetings, public rallies, legislative hearings to beg and plead for them to do something, because that's what we do with our 3-minute comments. We beg and we plead these agencies to please help us, make them stop. In 2011, we got the attention of agencies in a bigger way. A group of us out in Triangle Lake met a doctor who tested our urine for free. This is huge because it costs thousands of dollars to get your urine tested, and most laboratories won't test it for pesticides. So over 40 people tested their urine, and it came out positive for 2,4-D and atrazine, including my 2 children who were 5 and 10 at the time. That spurred on the Highway 36 exposure investigation. So the state came out then and tested our urine again, and again it came out positive for 2,4-D, and they told us that it was below the the safe threshold, so they couldn't do it. They couldn't do anything about it, So even after they found that, we were contaminated with pesticides, the regulatory agencies still wouldn't do anything. And that's because their hands are tied with corporate-influenced regulations that actually protect that single issue of aerial spraying. So in democracy school, you learn that the regulatory system was set up at the urging of the timber and railroad corporations. And I want to read a comment here. It's a quote by the U.S. Attorney General in 1893, and this quote is concerning the very first federal regulatory agency that was set up, and that was the Interstate Commerce Commission. So the U.S. Attorney General is assuring the president of Burlington Railroad, and this is about the ICC, and this really sums up the regulatory agencies today, why they were created. The commission, the ICC, is or can be made of great help to the railroads. It satisfied the popular clamor for government supervision of the railroads, and at the same time, that supervision is almost entirely nominal. Further, the older such a commission gets to be, the more inclined it will be to take the business and railroad side of things. It thus becomes a sort of barrier between the railroad corporations and the people, and a sort of protection against hasty and crude legislation hostile to railroad interests. So by design, regulatory agencies issue permits to harm. Then they regulate the amount of harm that takes place, making it look as if the whole time they're doing something about that harm, but in reality, they're just becoming a buffer between the corporation and our community that is being harmed. So seeing clearly that the system is rigged in favor of the corporations, they are not there to help us citizens. I then turned to work with the environmental groups a little bit more. And by then, after working with the agencies, these groups were now working on the issue of aerial herbicide spraying and looking as if they were helping those affected by exposures, but they were doing it by chipping away at those regulations still. Regulations that have been put in place by those corporations. But again, we're told that this is the only thing that we can do. We're told you got to go to the regulatory system, work with these environmental groups, go to the legislature. So, never really able to end the harms, only create larger buffer zones. I did not want buffer zones. I want the spraying to stop. Never really able to regulate it more. These environmental groups are perpetuating that rigged system by continuing to work within it and sustain it. So at this time, I was introduced to the community rights movement. This movement taught me that it wasn't a single issue, such as aerial spraying, that was the problem. It was actually corporate influence of agency regulations or corporate control and something called state preemption that was actually getting in my way. State preemption removes authority from the community and defines the legal relationship between the state and the municipalities as that of a parent to a child. So essentially, it's depriving all of our communities of our rights. My community, your community, the child, doesn't have the right to say no to the aerial spraying because the state of Oregon, the parent, has already taken that right away. And in this case, Oregon has taken that right away through a piece of preemptive legislation called the Right to Farm and Forest Act. So all this means that I and all of our communities within Oregon are helpless to stop the sprays. We don't have the right to know what they're going to spray. We don't have the right to know when they're going to spray. So we're taking things into our own hands. And with CELDEF, the help of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, they're the ones who put on the Democracy School. We wrote the charter amendment to ban aerial spraying of herbicides in Lane County. So like the suffragists, we're directly challenging the unjust laws that have governed Oregon forestry for far too long. With these local laws being written, we're occupying the law in order to bring attention to the unjust nature of them. And this is what we're doing with Freedom from Aerial Spraying Herbicides Bill of Rights. We're giving the people of Oregon a voice at the ballot box, a voice that has been drowned away by state preemptive legislation, and a voice that has been drowned out by corporate political donations. Community rights is about asking for what you really want, not asking for what you think you can get. And with the help of these ordinances and charter amendments, the community rights movement is actively engaging communities across the nation to stand up and enforce our inherent right to a healthy environment, a safe environment, and one free of timber corporation chemical trespass. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, next. I also want to make it clear with this that's been being passed around, it's not the petition, it's to sign up for email updates and possible ways to be engaged. Okay, Roy?
Sure. I want to modify my title up there. Yes, I am a forest consultant, and I'm a private timber broker, and I learned to be those things in the wilderness movement in the early 80s when the timber industry in Roseburg, Oregon blackballed me from being a timber cruiser and took away all my contracts. I went out to some of the farmers whose timber I was cruising, and I told them, you know, the mill's going to give you 30 cents on the dollar. I'll broker this timber for you. I'll get you 90 cents or $1.10 on the dollar. And got the satisfaction of starting to take something away from the forest industry and having a job that makes me independent. Jack Wilson, the editor of the Register Guard, said that by far I've published more opinion pieces on forest activities and forest practices in the newspaper than just about everyone else, Jack said, put together. So I use this title as a forest consultant and a private timber broker because it's hard now for the industry to work around me. If I'm talking about the money they gave away when they sold the Elliott parcels to Seneca, and I'm talking about you know, we the people getting 30 cents on the dollar, it's hard to call my bluff on that because it's not a bluff, it's knowledge. And because that's what I do. That's where I'm coming from. But I want to tell you where I really got my teeth. I got my teeth in forest conservation in the Siskiyou National Forest when I dropped out of my geochemical research job with Beckman Instruments and loaded up my truck and put some gold mining equipment in the back end. And I went to Southern Oregon and I dropped out off the grid into a place with a water-driven power wheel 20 miles off the road down the Illinois River and set up camp and said, I'm going to be here for a while. And in that period of time, I started meeting people and I started hearing the thump, thump, thump over the ridge. Thump, 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 thump. Well, I was in an Army infantry unit. I know about the thump, and my first piece of activism was in 1968 to join Veterans Against the Vietnam War, and I had brothers in arms who were sprayed because they were on long-range patrols along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I had two brother-in-laws who were backwashed and sprayed because one of them was a pilot. Their children have been damaged. Their children have been damaged. And we're still trying to settle the lawsuit. So it got to be very personal, the idea that I was living in the woods in Southern Oregon and they're spraying, and I found out they were spraying, guess what? Agent Orange. They sprayed Agent Orange the first time in 1965 in the Tonto National Forest in New Mexico. Why is it called Agent Orange? Because the 55-gallon drums have an orange stripe. Now, it could have been Agent Blue, which is a mixture of mercaptides and arsenic. And I know about the chemicals. But this was Agent Orange. Well, just harmless. Shoot a little diesel into it. What's a little 2,4-D? What's a little 2,4,5-T? What's a little toxin? And so that's what they were spraying, and there were barrels of that on the landing, but in those days I did not carry a camera in my cell phone. But we drove up to some of those landings, and what they were doing in the Siskiyou is they were laying down a lethal hit, a lethal dose of Agent Orange on top of tan oak and madrone and black oak that had basal sprouted and come up after they had savagely clear-cut units on the National Forest. Yes, they were still doing that in the 60s. Hot units that were on southwest exposures, units that came back to the only thing the unit could come back to. The site was trying to rebuild itself, and to do that, it needed to reset the mycorrhizae, it needed to reset the soil, it needed to put some shade up, it needed to get ready for the little spear-shaped Doug firs that would eventually come through. But the agency had already been captured by the industry, and they were in a position to try to hurry the process along, to try to mechanically hurry it, chemically hurry it, and so they sprayed units. And some of us live pretty much off of venison for our protein source, and we noticed dizzy deer staggering around these units out in the woods. We noticed a distinct drop in salmon populations in these creeks, and this was going on all over the board. And so we rallied, like you're doing now. We were unpaid volunteers. Yes, my kudos to everybody here for being volunteers. Because when you become a bureaucracy and the funding comes, it comes with strings, and before you know it, you're compromised. So stay fresh. Find something else to do for a living. Do not become a paid environmentalist. But anyway, avoid that, because you will be compromised. Anyway, we found out old ranchers. We had an old boy that owned a huge chunk of the Pistol River. And I don't remember John's last name. Gnarly old guy, been a logger and a rancher for 30-some-odd years up there in that country, and before that, his family lived there. And he was outraged with what was happening. He didn't get the chemistry. He didn't even understand the politics. All he knew is that they were poisoning the uplands. So we all came together, and we put a lot of pressure on the Forest Service, and at the same time, we had the 1974 Range Act coming down. We had friends of mine, including my forestry mentor, Gordon Robinson, working on the 1976 National Forest Management Act. And it called not for pure timber production. It called for maintaining biodiversity. And that became a wedge that we as citizens, just like community rights is a wedge, biodiversity became a wedge that we could begin to drive into the process. And we could begin to say, you know, this is not, what's wrong with tan oak? What's wrong with black oak? What's wrong with madrone? What's wrong with golden chinkapin? These are all parts of this ecosystem. You have no right to poison these things in favor of rapidly gaining your Doug fir monocultures. In fact, you have no right to replace native forest with monocultures. In fact, you have no right to be taking out native forest and falling into the whole agro-deforestation, chemical deforestation myth. You're supposed to be taking care of the forest. You're supposed to be foresters. I'm proud to be a forester, but I'm going to define a forester for you. A forester is not a businessman. A forester is not a liquidator. A forester is not a clear cutter. Not necessarily. Maybe a little patch cut up in Fort Lewis so that you can get something besides Doug fir and hemlock. But you're not a liquidator, and you're not, as Jerry Franklin puts it, a forest terminator. A forester is first of all called to protect forest. The early foresters were deeply into forest protection. You may pick bones with them later on because they disagreed with John Muir, but had it not been for those early foresters, the industry would have taken over America's forest. And they fought against the industry, and they were demonized by the industry, and I've been demonized by the industry. I get this. So a forester and forestry is the calling and the art and the science of keeping and developing the forest. It is not the business of removing the forest. It is not the business of converting the forest. You see, I'm cool with being a forester, and I'm cool with forestry. So listen to my friend John Sundquist, who isn't here this morning, but I wish he were. John has a great name for what they're doing out there on the industrial lands. Chemical deforestation. That's what they're doing. They're doing chemical deforestation. Call it what it is. Don't call it forestry. We need to re-educate the public, and to do that, we need to reach out and grab some words and bring them back and rinse them off and get the schluck and the corporate slime off of them and make them back into what the old dictionary said they really meant. Now, there were some lessons about the public forest. We rallied people by telling them, this is your forest. This is our forest. Really, it's its own forest, but it belongs to all of us by law. You see. Now, the private forest, the timber, the surface rights, particularly the surface rights to the timber, belong to the private owners. But here's some good news, and this is something we need to start preaching if we're going to have any success in bringing aerial herbiciding, which is an act of war against the forest and against the people. If we're going to knock the war zones out of this county, this is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to bring the public to a point where they realize that behind that locked gate is not only a bunch of BLM land with roads that your tax dollars paid for, but is a whole bunch of industry land that you own the water to, and you own the wildlife, and you own the fisheries, and you own the right to soil fertility, going all the way back to 14th century English law. You are not allowed to raise or waste the soil. So we have a bundle of rights on the other side of that locked gate. It's like the Woody Guthrie song. And we need to start publicly saying how that is. We need to take hold of this thing and raise it up to where we can tell the public, you don't have to put up with Roseburg Forest Products or Weyerhaeuser spraying your watershed because they're spraying your water, buffer or no buffer. Buffer's a piece of shit.
Right on.
It's like leaving 1 tree per acre, 2 trees per acre. I can take you out and show you some 300 and 400 acre clear cuts. There's no trees per acre. A buffer is just another bureaucratic administrative game. Just like the 2000 report on herbicides. Boy, read that. That's a piece of crap. 19 pages of goofball, quote, research done between OSU, who is strongly sponsored by the industry, and some bureaucrats, right? So anyway. So I want to close with a couple of suggestions, okay? The first one is, and I wrote these down when I came in here this morning. Do not ignore history. Become historians. Do not underestimate your adversary. It's not just Monsanto and Dow. It's Weyerhaeuser and Roseburg Forest Products owning over 500,000 acres in this county, deeply invested in chemical and fertilizers. You see? Unify. And you're doing that. And stay unified. And be willing to sharpen your strategy. Be willing to change strategy. Be willing to take on different strategies. See? But stay behind it. Stay behind it. That's how we won the Rogumpua Divide. We popped it on them at the last minute. Before they knew what was happening, we had Mark Hatfield and Jim Weaver and the Confederated Tribes all behind the Rogumpua Divide, heavily timbered. We just slipped it in there, and we ran with it, and we were totally unified. We did not let what was in Oregon Natural Resource and other groups take over our position on that. We rode in the seat so they could not give us away or trade us out. Anyway, That's what I have to tell you.
Thank you, Roy. As you know, the ultimate is the military-industrial complex is what we're up against. Chemical warfare on our entire
Yep.
planet.
Yep.
And like you said, keeping our strategies fresh and keep, play our cards carefully. Anyway, we have Dallin Ryan, author of War on Invasives.
Okay, hi everybody, thanks for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the herbicides that are being used in the private forests of Oregon and some concerns that we should all be having about them, and one of the reasons that we're trying to get this aerial spray ban passed. Some of the commonly applied herbicides in Lane County forests are the same as those that are used in conventional agriculture. So for those of us who attempt to purchase organic food or fiber, clothing, etc., we may be doing all that we can in our own personal lives to avoid some of these chemicals, but if we drink water in the state or grow food in the soils, as Roy mentioned, we're actually coming into contact with many of these herbicides. And contrary to popular belief, there's kind of this concept floating around out there that herbicides are less toxic or differently toxic to people than other pesticides. So there's kind of a more obvious relationship perhaps between something that kills an insect, which is out there crawling around. People can kind of understand that that might also have health effects on something like us that's also out there crawling around. And the idea that herbicides, because they kill plants, are less toxic to people is commonly marketed by the pesticide manufacturing industry. But indeed, herbicides are highly toxic, but they act differently, and all of them kind of have different modes of action. Some of the most common ones, such as glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup and other herbicide formulations that are commonly used in both in agriculture and forestry, actually shut down a metabolic pathway that both plants and bacteria use to mediate their immune function. So glyphosate or Roundup doesn't actually kill plants, but it kills their immune system and makes them vulnerable to diseases that are already present in the soil. Glyphosate was also originally patented as a chemical chelator, or a mineral chelator. It was actually first used to scrub mineral deposits off of dishwashers and air conditioning vents, because it actually binds up different minerals, and it does the same thing in the soil, and it does the same thing, interestingly, in mammalian and avian digestive systems. So there's not a lot of research about how glyphosate affects human beings yet, but there is research that shows that there are significant effects for both birds and mammals through the ingestion of glyphosate. And that's
There
just
is
one.
research, and they found it carcinogenic.
Well,
and the state of California.
Yes. So we're going to get into toxicity testing a little bit. What I meant to say was there's not specific research about the immune compromising effects of glyphosate in humans yet. It was also patented as an antibiotic by Monsanto in 2010. So it's known to kill bacteria in the soil. It kills beneficial bacteria. That's one of the ways that it acts to kill the immune system of the plants that it affects. And that's just one herbicide. They're often used in combination, as we'll talk a little bit more about. Other herbicides, such as 2,4-D, which was mentioned, is one half of Agent Orange. There's concerns that the 2,4-D is also contaminated by dioxin, which is one of the reasons that 2,4,5-T, which was the other half of Agent Orange, was removed from the market. They're very similar chemical compounds. The way that 2,4-D works is by creating rapid cell proliferation in plants. So plants grow like abnormally fast until they die. So essentially they use up all of their kind of juices that they have available until they die, which is very similar to how cells that are affected by cancer act. There's rapid cell proliferation. So that's one of the reasons why people are concerned about the continued use of 2,4-D, which is the second most widely used herbicide in the world after glyphosate. And then there's all the other ones, which all have their interesting effects, both on living creatures, big and small. So they affect bacteria, they affect fungi, they affect us as well. Probably 90% of the cells in our intestines are bacteria, and the effects that these types of compounds have on the things that are living inside us and keeping us healthy or making us unhealthy is completely unknown. And the way that these herbicides are tested and allowed to be brought to the market, it goes through the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the process of toxicity testing is very limited. All of the compounds that are currently on the market were run through a limited series of tests at the time that they were first introduced into widespread use in agriculture and forestry. So for some of them, that was 30 to 50 years ago. They have not been retested. So things like glyphosate, 2,4-D have been on the market for decades now and have only undergone some pretty rudimentary tests. So looking at 30, 90-day exposures, usually oral and dermal exposure. A lot of the tests that are looking at the amount of compound when you drink it or apply it to the skin of something like a rabbit or a dog. This is what they do for a toxicity test. How much can they take before half of them die in the test? That's what the toxicity test is looking at. It's called an LD50, lethal dose of 50% of the population that you're looking at dies. So, that's a very crude measurement tool. And so there's not a lot of there's no observation of smaller doses, non-sublethal dose, kind of chronic toxicity. The longest toxicity test timing window for carcinogenicity is 2 years of repeated dose. So there's no lifetime analysis for even the average lifetime of something like a dog, which is, oftentimes used as a stand-in for a human in these toxicity tests. So essentially we don't know. And there is no framework, kind of like what Eron was talking about, there's no framework for understanding the effects of these compounds, and the regulatory agency is essentially allowing for their continued use by only requiring that certain types of tests are necessary for these chemicals to be widely dispersed in our environment. And in Lane County, all of the purple squares up here, let's see, the yellow, well, this is basically private ownership in Lane County. And all of the different colors are different companies that own land in Lane County. And so as you can see, it's not right around the urban area, but anytime you go out into the so-called natural area, or if you live in some of these smaller communities such as Triangle Lake, or I live down in Cottage Grove, I'm right up in the industrial forestry heartland, and people are spraying herbicide with helicopters on a regular basis around where I live. And so for those of us who live in more rural communities where industrial forest management is the norm, the likelihood of exposure is high. And we talked about there's many different concerns with health effects of exposure to pesticides. There have been many different diseases linked to pesticide exposure, cancer being just one of them. The World Health Organization just in January declared glyphosate to be a probable human carcinogen. There's a lot of controversy over that finding and that statement, but there's many other things that can happen to somebody besides cancer.
You're talking about pesticides like herbs or animal bugs and stuff?
Herbicides or insecticides?
Right.
Both.
Herbicides are pesticides, not insecticides.
Yes. This slide just says pesticides, but
It refers to plants, right?
herbicides, yeah, are specifically designed to kill plants, but their mode of action is different. But if you think about all the scope of life on Earth, pretty much everything relies on plants for food. So whether we eat plants directly or whether we eat something that eats plants, everything in its kind of metabolic pathway relies on the types of things that are going on inside of a plant, the processes that make a plant a plant. If we're interfering with that by applying a chemical that kills the plant in some fashion, we're going to be affected by that as well. And it's different perhaps than what's going on with an insecticide, but it's potentially disease causing all the same. Some interesting research that's been going on in the non-human sector when it comes to potential herbicide effects is immune deficiency and mineral deficiency in wildlife, including deer and elk. I mentioned how glyphosate is a mineral chelator. One of the things that it binds, it actually removes things and makes them insoluble, such as copper and selenium. And some of the deficiencies of those minerals actually cause deer and elk to not produce the right amount of keratin, so that their hooves become deformed and their antlers become deformed. And hunters throughout heavily forested regions in Oregon are starting to see these types of deformities in deer and elk. And a lot of people are thinking that it's coming from the fact that these creatures are grazing on highly sprayed timberlands. So we're starting to see effects throughout the food web. It's not just us. There's also watershed impacts. Many of these compounds, when they're sprayed, especially from a helicopter, are mixed with various surfactants and adjuvants that make them stick onto the leaves of the plants that they are targeting. Oftentimes those adjuvants are more toxic or enhance the toxicity of the compound that's being applied. They want the herbicide to stick for a long time on the blackberries or the Scotch broom or the maple, as the case may be, that they're trying to eliminate from the forest stand. And so they put things in it that make it stay on there for weeks at a time, whether it's raining or snowing or whether the wind is blowing. And oftentimes those compounds are actually more toxic to fish, especially. There's a lot of kind of conversations in the works on the part of the regulatory agency to work on identifying what some of those surfactants and adjuvants are, how toxic they are. Those things are completely unregulated by the EPA if they're listed as a so-called inert ingredient. And, you know, for those of us who enjoy eating those fish or, you know, enjoy having a healthy biodiverse watershed, we should be concerned. Another interesting thing about the regulatory framework is that there's no requirement to test for toxicity on amphibians for any pesticide registration. For any pesticide currently used in the US, they use ducks as a stand-in for toxicity testing, probably because they know, you know, there's knowledge that these compounds are harmful to amphibians because their skin, just like ours, but it's a little bit more permeable. And one of the main concerns with what we're looking at here is that for many folks who live in rural areas and who enjoy, you know, making use of the natural beauty of Lane County and beyond throughout Oregon, you know, these chemicals have a likelihood of drifting. We have a strong likelihood of coming into contact with these compounds in our day-to-day lives. I have an organic farm just downstream from a major industrial forest operation. I don't apply herbicide or any types of pesticides on my property, yet I have the choice that somebody else is making on their private timber operation affecting my land that lies downstream from it, which is essentially chemical trespass. So I, as a landowner in Lane County, should have the right to remain free of anything that I, don't want to have on my property. And I think that this is potentially a point within this larger kind of conversation that could help people understand, even people who come from maybe a perhaps more conservative background, that property rights, it's a property rights issue as well. That we should all have the right to, have a safe and healthy environment of our choice. And I've had the opportunity to have some conversations with timber landowners about their choice to go towards the route of aerial herbicide application, because it's kind of this increasing trend where people feel that they're driven by market forces to have to engage in these type of practices, but it's kind of the race to the bottom, the downward spiral of increasing technological and chemical kind of management of our natural resource base. Whether it's agriculture, forestry, it's happening in all of these different orders. And as Roy mentioned, there was a successful push to ban aerial herbicide application from public land. So publicly managed lands already have models for managing timber without the use of aerial herbicides that could be applied. And what I look forward to is potentially having other models of forestry altogether, because one of the things about clear-cut based industrial forestry model that we see right now is that the forest operators are driven towards making those kinds of decisions because of the model of forestry they're engaged in. And if we could instead be managing our forests for high biodiversity, for multiple yields, and on a long-term basis, we could be providing more jobs, we could be providing high-quality timber products, we could be providing habitat for endangered species such as the spotted owl, all in the context of a working forest without the need for any type of herbicide or chemicals to be applied. It's just a different way of thinking about forestry and forest management. Keeping a forest intact, such as in this example of the Wildwood Forest in Vancouver Island, by keeping this forest standing, the forester here, Merv Wilkinson, was able to extract more timber than was initially present on his property over the course of 50 years than if he had cut it, replanted it, and cut it again, and there was more timber than ever on the site. And for those of us who have been thinking about how things could be different, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around this, but really working with biological systems to enhance their productivity and continue to achieve yields of the sort that we need from forests, we can really start thinking about doing things in another way.
Thank you, Tal. And next, Rob will give us more insights to the Community Bill of Rights approach.
Great. Hi, I'm Rob Dickinson. I'm with Freedom from Aerial Herbicides Alliance and also with Community Rights Lane County. And I need to make sure this actually shows up on the screen. Well, we made sure that Dow's presentation was available, but let's see if we can get just 1 second. Okay. So I live in Cottage Grove in sort of the rural part of the county. I'm actually not in an area that's directly sprayed, but I live well within the drift zone of where they are spraying and where the chemicals could drift onto my property and all of the plants that we're growing for our family to eat. I also live on a stream or a creek that the water is flowing from areas that are definitely being sprayed, so that water is definitely contaminated. I'm going to recap some of what we've already covered and then talk a little bit more about our initiative and what it does and how you can help. So again, why is aerial spraying so particularly harmful? Obviously, we've talked about how the herbicides and the pesticides in general are toxic and dangerous, but why is aerial spraying a particularly noxious form of the usage of those? Well, one, it's done from small aircraft, particularly when it's done in the forest context, it's usually helicopters. And the higher that the application is done, which is like the helicopters have to be flying above the tree line, the greater the degree that these chemicals get caught up in the wind forces and then end up deposited on things they weren't intended to be. And even though the buffers are 50 feet or really tiny amounts of distance, we know that these chemicals can drift miles, and so it's really just silly to think of that as any form of protection whatsoever. And when they drift, they will end up in waterways that they're not supposed to be in. They're going to end up drifting over homes, over schools, over crops that people are obviously growing to eat. They're going to drift over people. We know many people who've actually been outside when the drift is occurring and can literally taste the chemicals in their mouth. Livestock, it's very hard to keep your livestock from being subject to drift. And then there's just many other unintended victims of what we call chemical trespass. And the other thing is that we know that when these chemicals, these herbicides are sprayed aerially, that they're using greater volumes, which just means there's going to be more in the air, but there's also going to be more that's going to be getting into the soil and also ultimately getting into the watershed. And then the foresters will tell you that they apply these with incredible precision. It's going exactly where they want and not a foot beyond that. But we know that the day after that they've sprayed them, they're going to be revolatilizing, getting back up into the atmosphere, and then moving around. And so they're going to claim that they're going to be spraying on a day with no wind. But then what about the next day? So we know that's not good. And so then the real question is, if you're living in one of these areas, how do you protect yourself from the harmful effects of chemical trespass? And the obvious answer is you can't. There's really nothing you can do. For one, you have no idea when they're going to spray. I mean, they claim that they give you notification, but it's for a 3 months to 1 year window. So just plan to take right off 2016 because they're going to be doing something with you. You're not told exactly what they're going to use. They give you a long list of, sometimes it's 8 or 10 chemicals, and then you don't know exactly what was used or what combination or what percentages, and that doesn't help you if you're trying to figure out what the effects are. And then you really can't, even if you knew, you can't stay indoors for 3 months to a year. And then many people, especially in rural areas, have livestock. They have various animals, chickens, pigs, goats, whatever. And most of us really can't take them into our living rooms to keep them safe from the harm. And many of them are also going to be eating the plants that have been sprayed. And so that's going to mean that they themselves are contaminated. And then if you do get contaminated, if you do become a victim of chemical trespass, there's really very little that you can do if your health is damaged or your property is damaged. And it becomes next to impossible for regular people to prove the harm, both because of the enormous expense of the testing, and then as others in this room can attest, when they come to look at the plants, they try not to look at the ones that are damaged. So we know a lot about how toxic they are, and even the things where we're hearing that they're probable carcinogens, those are really understated. And then if you don't know exactly what you're exposed to, it's very hard to talk with a doctor about what you can do about it. And we know, again, livestock, pets contaminated, waterways are contaminated. In rural areas, many people actually depend on hunting and fishing for a good part of their food source, especially like their protein and their meat source. I know lots of people who stock up their freezers every year with deer and elk meat, and that meat is going to be contaminated. And we know people who have actually had their families, their children have sort of relatively rare neurological disorders, and you have to just wonder, why is that when they're eating, something that has these chemicals in it. there's a, in addition, the health effects ought to be enough to have us stop this practice, but there's also economic risk. The timber companies will say that it's necessary for our economy, but it's also destroying or hurting other economies as well. So any businesses that produce consumable products, those products are then contaminated. Sometimes they actually have to destroy it. Sometimes those products end up just getting harvested and sold, and we eat them. Obviously, we have a reasonable winery or wine-producing industry in our area, and that is affected. Those vineyards are meant to be lasting for 20 years or longer, and if they're affected by drift, that's a very expensive harm. And then, like Sean Daniel, Mountain Rose Herbs, he's talked about before. There's videos of his speeches where he's talking about how the products that he is spending time and money to produce end up being contaminated by pesticides, and then they can't sell them. And then we're also not talking about, and this is true in agricultural usage as well, but when we spray these herbicides, we're eventually we're killing lots of plants, what they would consider vegetation that they don't want, but we're also helping to produce weeds that are resistant to these same herbicides. So that means that we're creating a worse problem for the future. Eron, I think, talked quite a bit about how the regulatory system really fails to protect us. We know the notification system is practically worthless, and it's actually not designed to be accessible for us anyway. It's designed to be hard for us to access so that we don't really know. And then there's really no spray record that is public record. It's easy for us to go and look at and find out what was done. Okay. I guess one slide I took out about this chemicals. I think Dow talked about how the inert ingredients can be just as toxic, and that they're not really tested. That's been a controversy at the EPA forever. The scientists there know that those things are toxic, but there's just never been the political will to actually look into them. And I get to see some of the notifications thanks to Lynn over there now, and get to see the list of the chemicals and look them all up. And one day Lynn called me and said, "Oh, there's odor masters in this list." And I thought, well, that's really odd, right? We were just wondering, well, what could that be for, right? And then if anybody has ever had sort of a natural gas leak in their house, you know that it actually has a sort of rotten egg smell. And natural gas doesn't actually smell that way. The rotten egg smell is actually added because we want to know if there's a dangerous gas being emitted in our homes, right? So that smell is added so that we know that we're in danger and that we should deal with the leak. So you would think that they would not be adding an odor masker to these sprays. They would be adding an odor so that if anybody is subject to drift, they would actually detect it. But they're actually adding the odor masker, and it doesn't really take the odor away from the chemicals. It just basically disables your olfactory system, so that you just won't notice that you're around dangerous chemicals. And the first time that Lynn told me that, showed me that notification, it was actually for an area in Marcola near a school. I looked it up and got online and found out it wasn't that far. It was farther than their 50-foot buffer, but it was well within what could drift. So obviously, they didn't want the school kids who were out at recess to smell, hey, what is that smell? They wanted their olfactory systems to be disabled so they wouldn't know. So enough about, hopefully by now everybody is convinced that we ought to end this practice. Maybe you didn't come here with that question, but so what is our initiative? Okay, it's called the Freedom from Aerial Spraying of Herbicides Bill of Rights. And it basically establishes a right to be free from chemical trespass. And it also establishes a right to clean air and soil and water that is free from contamination by herbicides. We banned the aerial spraying of herbicides in Lane County. We think that many of the other pesticides that are used are also hazardous and should also be banned, but we were trying to go after what we thought was the predominant activity in the forest lands, which is the spraying of herbicides. It doesn't ban ground spraying or truck spraying of herbicides. We probably think that would be a good idea, but we're really trying to end the primary harm. And again, it allows for enforcement by the county or by any resident, and to have damages for those who violate the law. And it's Lane County only, and we think the same law ought to apply throughout the state, but we're starting here where we think we can get this done. It's what's called a charter amendment. We could pass an initiative, just a standard initiative, which would be an ordinance, which would basically be like as if the county commissioners passed a law at one of their regular meetings. But the reason we're going for a charter amendment is because if we passed just a standard ordinance, they could undo that, the county commissioners, the next month after we pass it. And we think that if we go to the work of passing it, that it should require a vote of the people to take it off the books, which we don't think will happen. We need 11,506 signatures to qualify this, to get it on the ballot. That's valid signatures, and so we really want to have over 14,000 signatures. We have longer than this, but we're targeting the May 2017 ballot if we can get our 14,000 signatures, which is a lot. We just started in November largely to collect signatures, and we really need more people. Most people don't know that we exist or that we have started this effort. And so really this conference here is our big sort of coming out party, letting people know that we're out there doing this. And what we need most of all is visibility that we're here and working on this, and volunteers to make it happen. So, question, what you're doing is great. How can I help? How can you help? Well, again, like the question is if we get more people in our county to know that we're working on this, that will likely result in more volunteers and more support. So spread the word. That's the first thing you can do. And we have lots of materials. Hopefully you got some brochures. Once you've looked over the brochure, if you can take off that little donation thing and volunteer slip and send it in, but hand the brochure off to somebody else. We really need to collect these 14,000 signatures. So with the, say, 20 people that we are now, it would take a long time, but if we had 100 people, it would go fast, and so you could help with that. A lot of people might be from Lane County here, and we definitely want your help and your signatures. But you don't actually have to be a Lane County resident to help us collect signatures. You don't even have to be a registered voter. You don't even have to be 18 or a citizen. If you're willing to pick up a clipboard, you can help us. And you can do it now. We have petitions at our table. You can host a house party. We're working on sort of the logistics of what exactly we would do at these house parties, but if you want to sign up and do that, just if you bring in even just a half a dozen people to your home, we'll come out, we'll help, we'll talk. We just want to, again, build our volunteer base, and that can be easy. It doesn't have to, you just have to serve some coffee, just water is fine. And we're coming up onto the season when there's a lot of events throughout the community, Earth Day and wildflower festivals. We want to have a presence everywhere we can be, and that means people who are willing to sit at a table or walk around with a clipboard. And if you don't feel able to do any of those things, but you feel like opening your checkbook, we need to raise at least $20,000 to get started for some of the work that we're doing. And we'll need to raise more when we actually are in a campaign for a ballot measure. And so those are the things you can help with. And anything else you want to help with, we'd love to talk to you. So thank you. Before I stop, oh wait, I have another slide. Upcoming events. If you're convinced, then your job is to bring more friends to our events, okay, to help them be convinced. So we've got a couple events scheduled for the next month or so. We're doing two different versions of the same event, one in Cottage Grove and one in Eugene. We're going to do a double feature documentary film event showing two great short films. One is 19 minutes, one is like 30. One is Drift, which is a community seeking justice, again, talking about the harms of aerial spray, and Behind the Emerald Curtain on a similar subject. One's coming up in just a week and a half in Cottage Grove on the March 15th, which I think is a Tuesday. And these are all free events. And we have these handouts here. There's two of them. They look the same. They just have different days and places. And grab those either here at our table. And then we have one on April 4th in Eugene, and we'll have these filmed, but then we'll have a discussion, and we can also introduce new people to how they can help. And then this is a community rights initiative, and we have a monthly meeting of the community rights supporters in Lane County on the third Monday of every month, and it's always at the First United Methodist Church on Olive Street, and that's coming up in March in a few weeks as well. and you can come there or bring new people there, and that would be great. Thanks again.
Thank you.